The wind cut through the bare trees like broken glass, howling low across the empty parkland that bordered the lake. March in northern Idaho was a cruel season. Too tired to be winter, too bitter to be spring. The ground was muddy with thawed snow, but the lake, wide and still, held onto its skin of ice, cracked, fragile, deceptive. It looked solid from the shore, reflecting the pale sky, but the surface was no longer trustworthy. No one noticed the boy at first. He was small, bundled in a coat too big for his frame, the hood falling back as he ran. His boots slapped against the damp ground, splashing through puddles. His name was Noah, and he was 7 years old, quick to wander, quick to disobey, filled with a kind of restless curiosity that ignored the cold and warnings alike. His mother had turned away for a moment, distracted by her phone or a conversation. That was all it took. Noah approached the lake with the careless confidence of a child who believed the world would bend around him. The first step onto the ice made a dull, muted sound. The second step echoed faintly. The third made a noise that should have stopped him, a hollow crack that seemed to pause the air around him. But it was already too late. The ice gave way beneath his feet without a scream, without ceremony. It collapsed like glass beneath weight it could no longer bear. One moment he was upright, the next he was gone, swallowed by black water. Cold closed over his head with a terrible silence. From the edge of the park, the dog saw. Lucky was a shepherd mix, strong but lean, with a thick coat still shedding the last of its winter roughness. He had come from a shelter just weeks before, still adjusting to the warmth of a home, still learning what it meant to belong. But none of that mattered when he saw the boy disappear. There was no calculation, no hesitation. He broke into a run. His paws struck the frozen mud with force, his breath steaming from his mouth in short bursts. He didn't bark. He didn't look back. The ice cracked beneath his weight as he bounded toward the hole, already widening as the water pulled chunks beneath the surface. He reached the edge where Noah had vanished and leaped in without slowing. The shock of the water hit like a blow. Ice closed around his chest, dragged at his legs. He went under, then kicked hard, surfacing with a spray of freezing droplets. His ears flattened. His nose worked frantically. He paddled through the shards of ice, slamming against them with his shoulders, his paws. Somewhere below, a small body moved, or maybe it didn't. Lucky dove. The cold bit into his lungs. His legs trembled. The water pressed into his ears, filled his mouth. But he found the boy. A sleeve, a boot, a still shape, suspended in the dark. Lucky grabbed the coat in his teeth and pulled. His limbs screamed. His vision blurred. But he kicked toward the hole, the only patch of sky in a world of black. From the shore, the first scream broke the silence. A woman shouting. Footsteps pounding. But Lucky didn't hear. He was dragging life back to the surface, inch by inch, stroke by stroke, toward a world that was only now beginning to notice it might lose a child and a dog. The scream tore through the stillness of the park like a siren, sharp, raw, and panicked. It came from the lake's edge, from a woman whose voice cracked as she called a name that no one else yet understood. People turned. Joggers slowed. Parents looked up from strollers. A man dropped his coffee. For a second, there was only confusion. Then, they saw the hole in the ice. Near the opening, a shape moved in the water. Not the boy, but the dog. Lucky. His fur was soaked and heavy, clinging to his body in icy mats. His legs thrashed against the water's weight as he tried to keep the child above the surface. The boy's limbs hung limp, dragged by his coat. His head tilted back unnaturally. Lucky's jaws clenched around the fabric, pulling, losing grip, finding it again. His back legs kicked, but his strength was failing. Each movement was slower than the last. Lucky pushed the boy toward the jagged edge of the ice where cracks had spread like veins across glass. He reached the rim, tried to lift the child, slipped. Ice broke beneath his front paws. He vanished for a breathless second, then reappeared, choking, gasping. but silent. He never made a sound. A man rushed from the trees. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the ice and reached out, crawling forward with cautious, desperate movements. He grabbed the boy's hood just as Lucky gave a final push. With a grunt, the man dragged the child across the surface, careful not to let his own weight sink them both. Others followed, forming a chain, calling for help. When they finally got Noah to the shore, his body was still. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were blue. There was no breath, no pulse. The world closed in with a terrible quiet, as someone began chest compressions. Gloves pressed against his ribs. A face hovered above his. A rhythm formed. Push, breathe, push, breathe. Time stretched like the cold wind across the lake. Then a cough, a spasm. Water burst from the boy's mouth. His back arched. Air scraped into his lungs. The crowd exhaled together, relief, disbelief, tears. But in the water, further out now, the dog floated face down. Lucky no longer kicked. His body bobbed gently with the movement of the lake, his snout partially submerged. His fur barely moved. He drifted in silence, the energy that had once driven him gone. No more struggle, no more sound. The man who had pulled the boy in turned back too late. Lucky had saved the child and vanished into stillness. The voices blurred into a single current of noise, panic, relief. Orders shouted into radios. Somewhere nearby, a child sobbed, wrapped in an emergency blanket, still shaking from cold and shock. But Tom heard none of it. His focus narrowed to a silent shape drifting away from the hole in the ice. The dog. He didn't hesitate. He threw off his jacket and ran, his boots sliding across the slick, half-frozen shoreline. As he reached the edge, the others shouted after him, but he was already diving in, the cold slicing into his chest like broken glass. The water swallowed him whole. He kicked hard beneath the surface, searching. There, just beneath the ice, a shadow. Limbs limp, fur fanned out like a drowned flag. Tom gripped the dog's torso with one arm and pushed toward the surface, gasping as he broke through, pulling the weight with him. Lucky was heavy now, waterlogged, breathless, lifeless. He hauled him to the shore, arms burning, lungs on fire. Two bystanders ran to help drag the dog onto the snow-covered bank. His body flopped like a soaked rag, tongue out, eyes dull and unfocused. He looked empty. Tom didn't pause. He dropped to his knees beside the dog and began chest compressions, locking his hands over the rib cage and pressing rhythmically. His hands shook. Every push was a silent plea. He leaned in, gave 2 quick breaths through the dog's nose, then resumed the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 30. Again. Someone tried to tell him it was no use. Just a dog. But Tom didn't look up. His hands kept working, even as his own fingers numbed. He could feel the ribs flex beneath the pressure, could hear the wheeze of air forced in and out. Lucky didn't move. His eyes stayed open, but vacant. His body gave nothing back. Tom leaned in again. More breaths. His ear brushed the wet fur. He listened, waited. Then, something, so faint it could have been imagined. A twitch in the chest. A flutter, like a thread pulled tight for half a second. A beat. Just one. Then silence again. But Tom latched onto it like a lifeline. He changed his rhythm, adjusted the angle of his hands, pushed harder, slower. Another breath. Another round of compressions. The crowd grew quiet behind him, their eyes fixed on the man kneeling in the snow beside a dying dog. Minutes passed like hours. Then Lucky jerked once, a small involuntary spasm, followed by a rasping noise in his throat. His mouth opened slightly, a gurgle. Then another breath, weak and shallow, but real. Tom froze, hands hovering, unsure if he had imagined it. But then Lucky's chest rose on its own. The dog coughed, water splattering from his nose and mouth, then lay still again, wheezing softly. Tom sat back on his heels, soaked, shivering, his hands red with cold and effort. But his eyes didn't leave the dog. He reached out and rested 2 fingers against the side of Lucky's neck. This time, the pulse was faint, but steady. The snow had begun to fall again, not in flurries, but in slow, deliberate flakes, descending through the gray Idaho sky like ash from a distant fire. The surface of the lake had settled, the ripples stilled, and the gaping hole through which boy and dog had vanished was already starting to freeze over, thin threads of ice reaching across the opening like veins mending a wound. On the bank, Tom stayed crouched beside the dog. Lucky's body remained motionless, apart from the faintest rise and fall of his chest. Each breath was fragile, as if borrowed from another world. The air steamed around his mouth, barely enough to be seen. The silence had grown heavy, oppressive, thick with resignation. Other rescuers stood nearby, their faces tight with fatigue and helplessness. One of them finally spoke, not loudly, not cruelly, just quietly, as if to break the spell. It was the kind of sentence spoken when hope has already packed its bags. But before it could settle in the air, Lucky's body twitched. It was not graceful or strong. It was a tremor, a full-body shudder that passed through him like a wave of electricity. His limbs flinched, stiff and uneven. Then, without warning, his chest heaved. A gasp erupted from his throat, wet and sharp, like the sound of a breath taken after drowning. It echoed in the stillness. All eyes turned. Another breath followed, then another, short, rough, and desperate, but breaths nonetheless. Tom dropped back to his knees, pressing his hands lightly against Lucky's side. The dog's eyes fluttered open. They were glazed and unfocused, the pupils too wide, as if the world was still hidden behind layers of frost. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't even seem to register the snow falling on his face. But he was alive. Blankets came quickly. Emergency responders moved with practiced urgency, wrapping Lucky in thick thermal layers. Someone brought a portable oxygen unit. The mask didn't fit perfectly, but they made it work. Warm air hissed gently against his muzzle. A pair of hands held his head steady. Tom's own hands were shaking. He hadn't realized how cold he was, or how long he'd been kneeling in the snow, soaked through. But he didn't move away. He watched as the rise and fall of Lucky's chest grew more regular. An emergency vehicle pulled up onto the service road, tires crunching over frozen gravel. The rear doors flew open. 2 rescuers lifted Lucky onto a stretcher, securing him gently beneath more blankets and a heating pad. He didn't resist. His eyes remained half-lidded, barely reacting to light or sound. They drove quickly. The veterinary clinic was across town, just beyond the last row of houses where the forest began. It had seen its share of emergencies, but none quite like this. Not a dog dragged from freezing water, not one who had stopped breathing and come back. Inside the ambulance, the oxygen mask slipped slightly. One of the responders adjusted it. The other kept a hand on Lucky's chest, not for treatment, but for reassurance. A physical reminder that the breath still came. Barely. But it came. The clinic stood on the outskirts of town, half lit by flickering floodlights and buried beneath a quilt of snow that dulled every sound. Inside, the air was sterile and too quiet. Monitors beeped softly, their rhythms calm but uncertain, and the hallway lights flickered just enough to cast long shadows against the pale walls. They brought Lucky in wrapped in blankets, still damp despite the layers, his fur clinging to his thin frame. His breathing was shallow. Each inhale sounded like paper torn in slow motion. The cold had seeped deep into him, beyond muscle and bone, into something that machines couldn't easily warm. His body trembled beneath the surface, though outwardly he remained still. The veterinarian, an older man with eyes that had seen too many lost causes, examined Lucky with firm hands and a quiet urgency. He listened to the rasp of his lungs, checked the oxygen levels, monitored the heart rate that stuttered irregularly beneath the skin. When he turned to the team, he didn't sugarcoat it. The damage was severe. The dog's core temperature was critically low. His lungs were filled with fluid. They could stabilize him, but there were no promises. They placed Lucky inside a thermal recovery unit, a clear capsule with warm, circulating air, heat radiating through the bottom and sides. Tubes connected to his nose and limbs, delivering oxygen, fluids, and medications. Sensors blinked and glowed in uncertain patterns. A light above the chamber cast a soft glow on his motionless face. His eyes were closed. His breath came in faint shudders. Tom sat on a stool beside the capsule, elbows on knees, hands clasped as if in prayer, though no words were spoken. He didn't change out of his wet clothes. He didn't ask for coffee or warmth. His gaze didn't waver. The others came and went, voices hushed, footsteps light. No one asked him to leave. Outside, the storm grew heavier. Snow thickened against the windows, erasing the outlines of trees and distant houses. Time passed without measure, counted only by the slow drip of IV fluid and the dull rhythm of Lucky's mechanical breath. At one point, a nurse offered a blanket. Tom didn't answer. His focus remained on the still form inside the capsule. He watched the rise and fall of the dog's chest. Sometimes it seemed to pause too long. Sometimes he leaned forward, unsure if he'd imagined the movement at all. Hours dragged. The building emptied. Lights dimmed in the hallway. Even the machine seemed quieter. Then, sometime after midnight, Lucky's tail moved. It wasn't much, just the slightest twitch, barely perceptible. A muscle contraction maybe, a reflex. But Tom saw it. His eyes had not left the dog for even a second. And in that movement, that almost accidental flicker of life, he felt something shift. Lucky was fighting, not in the way humans did, not with sound or expression, but with presence, with breath, with the small insistence of a tail refusing stillness. Tom leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but something in his posture eased. A fraction. This was the same dog who had hurled himself into ice without hesitation. The same dog who had dragged a lifeless child to the edge of safety. The same dog who had stopped breathing and come back again. Now, in the quiet dark of a snow-covered clinic, Lucky wasn't done. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a thinning of the gray, as if the sky was finally exhaling after holding its breath for days. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a soft, undisturbed layer that blanketed the roads and rooftops in silence. Inside the clinic, the world stirred slowly. 2 days had passed since Lucky had been pulled from the edge. His breathing had steadied. The fluid in his lungs had begun to clear. His body, warmed from the inside out, had started to reclaim itself. Movement returned gradually. First a flick of a paw, then the shifting of a leg as he tried to adjust his weight beneath the blankets. The machines hummed beside him, quieter now, more stable. On the morning of the second day, he tried to stand. It was ungraceful, slow, and brief. His legs trembled beneath him, and he sank back onto the bed almost immediately. But he tried, and then he tried again. By evening, he was able to hold himself up, his head lifting just enough to meet the eyes of those who watched over him. By the end of the week, he began eating from a hand. The first meal was cautious, just a few bites of soft food offered on the palm of a nurse, then from Tom himself. Lucky's eyes were still tired, but alert now, focused. He recognized the warmth of touch, the smell of the man who had dragged him back from the dark. His tail moved more often now, slow and steady like the ticking of a newly repaired clock. After a month, he walked beside the boy again. Noah had recovered quickly. Children often do, their bodies resilient in ways the mind takes longer to catch up to. But when he took the leash in his small hand and stepped outside with Lucky for the first time since that day, he was quiet. They walked side by side along the same lake shore. the one where silence had nearly become permanent. The ice still clung to the water in broken patches, gray and melting. Cracks ran through it like veins, and puddles pooled near the edges. Lucky stopped when they reached the bend in the path. He stared at the lake, unmoving. His ears twitched. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the water, and then he turned away. They continued on, Noah keeping one hand lightly on the dog's collar. Neither of them hurried. The wind stirred the last of the winter air, and their footsteps left paired impressions in the damp earth. Neither of them looked back. After that, Lucky never went near the lake again. But each night, without fail, he climbed onto the foot of Noah's bed. He lay down beside him, silent and watchful. Sometimes he would shift closer when the boy stirred. Sometimes he would rest his head on the edge of the blanket. He never left until Noah's breathing settled into the calm rhythm of sleep. It was as if he had to be sure, as if he needed to know, again and again, that the boy was still alive. And every night, after the house fell quiet and the lights dimmed to nothing, Tom would sit alone in the hallway, staring at the closed bedroom door, and remember the moment when the dog's heart had beat once, and then again. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Do you believe animals have a soul? Don't forget to hit the bell. More true and touching stories are coming soon.